when the Russian people all decide to do something, and perhaps it's not even organized, that's the kind of stuff that Putin can't control. And if it spins more out of control than it does, with Wagner people or those people marching towards the airport, but something more crazy and out of control, that may be the moment that it all comes undone for Putin.
The jailed Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny has made his first public appearance in a video call since being moved to an Arctic penal colony. Navalny had been moved to the IK3 penal colony, nicknamed Polar Wolf, in the northern town of Karp, some 1,200 miles northeast of Moscow. It's seen as one of the toughest jails in Russia, and most detainees held there have been convicted of the most serious crimes. Well, I've been speaking with Bill Browder, the high-profile Kremlin critic and author of Red Notice, How I Became Putin's Number One Enemy. And he gave me this reaction to Navalny's behaviour in court today.
This is his way of defying Putin. Putin is trying to do everything he can to destroy, demoralize, poison, oppress Alexei Navalny. And Alexei's response is to effectively stand up and say, anything you do doesn't touch me. And it's a very powerful message. This is the kind of message that appeals to regular Russian people that are saying, that are rooting for the underdog, that are saying, we want a alternative to Putin, and this guy is tough. And so I think he's very successful in his in effectively his political opposition.
He's still President Putin's biggest domestic critic, but how much do regular Russians get to hear and see him make these kind of protests, even though they are from remote jails?
Well, certainly not as much as he would like. The purpose of sending Alexei to the most remote jail in the country is to isolate him, to make sure that he's not visible. But in these situations, at least, on the internet, on YouTube, on Twitter, this information leaks out and it gets to some people. And it's not just getting to them at this moment in time, but it's sort of creating a legend for him in the future. And so, he's not able to be on television, on state television, outlining his campaign manifesto. But it's kind of like Nelson Mandela, who sat in Robben Island for multiple decades. Eventually, there may be a moment. We don't know when that is. Putin doesn't know when that is. Navalny doesn't know when that is. When everything self-destructs for Putin and the Russian people are looking for an alternative. And he has positioned himself as that alternative.
What is his immediate future? Because clearly the Russian authorities are trying to push him out the way as much as possible. I mean, he's 1,200 miles northeast of Moscow in what looks like brutal conditions. How much help is he getting? How much contact is he getting from his lawyers?
Well, he's getting some contact from his lawyers because he's on Twitter. If anyone who follows him on Twitter can see messages that he hands to his lawyers that are then telegraphed on Twitter. He was joking about how cold it was in the exercise yard yesterday. He's joking about various other things. And so he does have contact with his lawyers. They're doing everything possible to isolate him by putting him there. It's not easy to get to. It's almost an impossible trip to get up there. But he does have a very dedicated team of people who are supporting him. And as best as he can, he has some way of communicating with the outside world.
But when it comes to, hopes ahead of these presidential elections in Russia, I mean, there isn't much hope, quite frankly, is there? I mean, Navalny's urged his supporters to vote for anyone but Putin in the elections in March. But not a single one of Putin's nominal rivals has said they're actually aiming for victory.
Well, I think it's even a mistake to call it an election. It's a nonsense. Yeah. Putin kills, imprisons, or exiles anybody who has any chance, as we've seen with Boris Nemtsov, who was one of his rivals, who was murdered in front of the Kremlin. Of course, Alexei Navalny, as we're discussing, is sitting in jail. Garry Kasparov, the chess champion, is in exile in the United States. And so there's not an election going on. And by the way, in addition to all of that, they also stuff the ballot boxes. And so, Putin wins more than 100% of the vote in some regions. And so it's not an election per se. And Alexei Navalny's chance is not having to do with an election. It's having to do with civil unrest. If all of a sudden, something precipitates the Russian people rising up, and there's many things that could do that, as we've seen in other countries, and the Russian people have risen up and Putin jumps on his private jet to China or Saudi Arabia or wherever, the Russian people will be looking for who's going to pull it back together. And that's where Alexei Navalny steps in.
How likely, though, is something like that to happen again? I mean, we saw it almost happen, didn't we? When the Wagner group marched on towards Moscow, but stopped halfway, and we all know what the end result of all that was. So, what would bring those circumstances on for it to happen again?
Well, I would say it's very unlikely, but who knows? I mean, it's more than 300,000 Russian soldiers have died. There's just these crazy images floating around of people in Moscow no longer having heat. They're freezing to death in various regions of Russia right now. There's terrible economic hardship because of this war. And so anything could precipitate it. And the one thing I should point out is that Putin is really good at assassinating people like Prigozhin and putting people like Navalny in jail. He's really good at sort of targeting individuals. He's really bad at standing up to mass uprisings. Remember when Prigozhin was marching towards Moscow with his 8,000 soldiers, there was nothing they could do about it. They didn't know what to do. There was an incident, a highly anti-Semitic incident in the Caucasus where all sorts of people sort of rose up and marched towards the airport looking for people coming from Israel, and there was nothing they could do about that. I mean, they're basically, when the Russian people all decide to do something, and perhaps it's not even organized, that's the kind of stuff that Putin can't control. And if it spins more out of control than it does, with Wagner people or those people marching towards the airport, but something more crazy and out of control, that may be the moment that it all comes undone for Putin. And remember, nobody ever predicted the Arab Spring. It started in Tunisia with a fruit seller who set himself on fire, and then it spread to Egypt and all over the place. And so these things are impossible to predict. It's hard to know, and that's what makes it so scary for Putin. I mean, he spends a lot of his time thinking about what happened to Gaddafi and Ceausescu and all sorts of other dictators.
It will be the people, not a group, who provide the uprising. Bill Browder there talking, high-profile Kremlin critic, author of Red Notice, How I Became Putin's Number One Enemy. We had this amazing conversation that you just heard there with him, because Alexei Navalny, who is the jailed Russian opposition leader, he made his first public appearance, incredibly defiant, in a video call today since being moved to an Arctic penal colony, even joking with court officials.